let's check back with our intrepid scientist, Adrian. When we last saw Adrian, he was trying to determine the genetic basis for flying hamster coat color. To understand his experiment, though, we'll need to learn a little bit more about how the genetic makeup of these hamsters impacts the coat color. Now, in a diploid organism, we know we have 2 copies of every gene. We also know that different versions or alleles of the gene may exist. Let's say we represent the coat color gene with the letter B. That means I could represent 2 different alleles with either the uppercase or lowercase b. Because the flying hamster is diploid, it also means that it could have 2 copies of the same allele. I could have 2 big B's, or I could have 2 little b's in the same organism. I could also have a scenario where I have 1 of each kind of allele in a given hamster. We refer to a locus that has 2 different alleles as heterozygous, and one that has 2 copies of the same allele, homozygous. Now, let's remember that Adrian hypothesized that the coat color of his hamsters was determined by a single locus. So let's apply our new knowledge of alleles so that we can refine this hypothesis a little bit. Now let's say that the big B allele represents brown, and we'll have the little b represent white. So let's see then what's going to happen in the case of the 3 different genotypes that a hamster can have. So it should be fairly obvious that if I have 2 brown alleles, I should produce a brown hamster. If I have 2 white alleles, I should produce a white hamster. But what happens when I have 1 of each kind of allele? The heterozygous state is resolved by considering the relationship between alleles. Adrian decides to breed a brown hamster with a white one. He finds that the brown and white hamster mating only produces brown hamsters. Adrian has encountered one of the central principles of genetics. While there may be more than 1 allele associated with a given gene, one trait is sometimes dominant over the other one. Since the brown and white populations of hamsters always produce the same color, so for instance, if I have a brown hamster mating with a brown hamster, we always see brown hamsters. And by the same token, if I have white hamsters mating, they always are producing white hamsters in these specific populations that he's isolated from the wild. So we know that these parent hamsters came from populations that are referred to as true breeding. What that means is, in terms of the trait we're talking about, brown hamsters that are mated with brown hamsters always produce more brown hamsters. White hamsters mated with white hamsters always produce more white hamsters. Since that's the case, we can infer that the genotype of these animals are big B for the brown one, and little b for the white one. Therefore, all of the progeny from this cross should have a big B, little b genotype. The fact that all of these hamsters in the progeny generation are brown indicates that the brown allele is dominant over the white allele. So a dominant trait is referred to as a trait which is expressed in the heterozygous state. That means that a recessive trait is a trait which is not expressed in the heterozygous state. Geneticists usually represent the dominant allele with a capital letter and the recessive allele with a lowercase letter. So this experiment has provided Adrian with some data that supports his hypothesis that flying hamster coat color is determined by a single locus. And we'll see how further experimentation can provide more support for this hypothesis. In this lesson, we've learned that an organism homozygous at a given locus possesses 2 copies of the same allele. For instance, if we're talking about gene B, big B, and little b are both homozygous genotypes. An organism heterozygous at a given locus possesses 2 different alleles. For instance, big B, little b would be an example of a heterozygous genotype. A dominant trait is the trait which is expressed in a heterozygous state. A recessive trait is the trait which is not expressed in a heterozygous state.